Welcome back as we continue to talk about this great attitude of gratitude. It really is a distinguishing mark for people when they're grateful. Last week we talked about complainers and how nobody really likes to be around complainers. Nobody likes to be around somebody that's always pointing out the negative. And yet at the same time, we talked about many of those complainers would say that they're not really complaining. They're just reporting the facts because they're saying something like, oh, if you knew how much I got shortchanged, if you knew this bad deal that I got, if you knew what happened to me here, how I got ripped off, how I got hurt, and nobody else has ever experienced this before, let me just tell you about it. They would tell you that they're just sharing the facts, that they're not really complaining. But we also talked about, too, that if we were to actually listen to some of those words coming out of our own mouth, or if we wrote them down and we actually looked at them and we said, oh, I don't like the way that those sound, what we need is not a vocabulary change. We need a heart change. We need a perspective change. We need to view our world differently. It's kind of like this. If you have kids, maybe you've heard this before, your kids that have already had a meal, maybe they've already had a meal and some snacks, and they come to you and say, Mom, Dad, I'm starving. And you want to say, really, do you really understand what starving is? Do you really understand that there's some people that don't have access to even a fraction of the food that you have? Or it kind of cracks me up sometimes, people waving around an expensive cell phone and they're going, is there no Wi-Fi in this place? And I want to say, really? You have a phone in your hand worth hundreds and hundreds of dollars, and just because you can't get access to your information or you can't send out a text or check your social media that much faster, that all of a sudden it's a hardship for you? No, I'm not talking about this being a glass half full or glass half empty thing. That's what people have said before. Like if you took a glass of water and it was right at the halfway point, the pessimist looks at it and says, oh, that glass is half empty. The optimist looks at it and says, oh, that glass is half full. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this perspective, this realization that there are some people that don't even have a glass. There's some people that have a glass, but they don't even have access to put water in the glass. It's that kind of understanding because, see, when we don't have that perspective, when we don't realize how good we really have it, it's really natural and really easy to slip into complaining. There was something that happened to me when I was 19 years old, and I've shared this story before, but it so profoundly changed my perspective. I can never undo what I learned in that time. It was the lead up to Christmas. And my church had collected a bunch of toys to give out to families that were going to struggle that year to be able to give gifts to their kids. And for whatever reason, I don't know why, my church called me and asked me, just a teenager, would you distribute these toys? And so I had a trunk full of toys, and I recruited a couple of friends, and I was just given a piece of paper with addresses on them. And so I used my dad's real estate maps, and we navigated our way through the city. And when we get to the house, we had no idea who was inside the house. We didn't know how many kids there were, what the ages were they boys, were they girls, what kind of toys did they already have, that sort of thing. So we'd have to go up and knock at the door and step in the house, introduce ourselves, kind of assess the situation, and then go back out to the car and try to pick out appropriate toys. And sadly, there was a lot of places where we would hand out the toys, and they were just kind of like, And the mom or the dad would have to prompt them, well, at least say thank you. But they didn't really seem very grateful. And as God's perfect timing would have it, the last house on our list, we still had quite a few toys left in the trunk of the car. And as usual, we went up and knocked on the door, and we walked inside. And here's what I saw. I saw Mom and Dad in the kitchen with, it seemed like, very mismatched pots and pans. The kitchen table was a card table that had 4 mismatched chairs around it. In the family room was kind of a rugged-looking couch, and there was a brick holding up one corner of it. And over in the corner was one of those little scraggly Charlie Brown Christmas trees with a string of lights on it, but no presents underneath it. There was a little boy and a little girl in that room that had some simple toys that they were playing with on the floor and on the couch. And Mom and Dad explained to us that they had to leave town unexpectedly for a family emergency. And while they were gone, some bad guys backed a truck up to their house and cleaned them out. And by cleaning them out, I mean cleaned them out. They took the Christmas tree and all of the presents under the tree. They took the furniture and all of the clothing in the furniture, all of the clothing in the closets. They took all of the pots and pans in the kitchen. They took the refrigerator and all of its food. They took all of the food that was in the pantry. When this family returned home, it was like they were walking in to a vacant house. And so they began to cobble things together to get ready for Christmas. And you know what? They were happy. They were grateful to have each other. They were grateful for the food that had been provided for them. They were grateful for the few toys that their kids did have to play with. And I remember the two buddies that I picked to go with me, since we were going to some rough neighborhoods. I picked kind of some of my burly friends, and they were tough guys. And as we walked out to the car, all of us were fighting back tears. And these two tough guys looked at me and said, "We're giving them everything we've got left in the car." And we emptied out the trunk and just took in armloads of toys for them. Really kind of changes your perspective, doesn't it? See, it's so easy for us to complain and grumble about what we don't have and forget to be grateful for what we do have. But you see, there's a warning in this that I think E.M. Bounds captured very well. Here's what he told us. Gratitude and murmuring never abide in the same heart at the same time. What's he saying? I think what he's saying is very true. When you're grumbling, you can't be grateful. But the flip side is just as true. When you're being grateful, you can't be grumbling. So we have to choose. What are we going to focus on? What I don't have, and I'm going to grumble about that, or what I do have, and I can be grateful for that. There is a great story that is told in the Gospels, and this is one of those rare stories that is told in all four of the Gospels. I'll share the references below. I hope that you'll look them up, but it's in Matthew chapter 26, Mark chapter 14, Luke chapter 7, and John chapter 12. And the story is Jesus and his disciples are invited to have dinner at the home of a man named Simon, who is a Pharisee. Simon is obviously wealthy because the house has a lot of servants there and a lot of guests are there. So that tells us about the food and the financial status that Simon the Pharisee would have. Except that Simon didn't invite Jesus out of gratitude in his heart or saying, "Hey, I really want to get to know you a little bit better." When you read in the scripture, the Gospels record this, that they were really looking for a way to trap Jesus. So they thought, what a better way to do this than let's invite Jesus to dinner and have him sit down and maybe start asking him some questions, and let's just sit there and just watch him. Let's just keep our eyes right on him and keep our ears open. Let's watch something that he says, something that he does, that we can go, aha, now we have grounds to accuse him. And because they were so focused on trying to catch Jesus with this, Simon completely lost sight of what his host duties were. See, as the host, when his guests came into his house, what he should have done first is provide a servant that would wash their feet, their dusty feet, as they traveled, because when they came to dinner, they're not going to sit like I'm sitting in a chair right now around a dinner table. They would lounge at the dinner table, which means that their feet would kind of be up in the air near other people. And so when they came in the house, they were supposed to have their feet washed. And then they were supposed to have a perfume, an anointing that was kind of very symbolic and very welcoming. And then there was supposed to be a hug and a kiss. Welcome to my home. Now, one of the other things that Simon did have in his home is that he would allow the people that hadn't been invited to the dinner party, the kind of down and out, the people that were maybe not as well off, they could come in and they would stand around the edge of the room, around the dining table, and then they could get scraps of food. They could get some leftover. Some of the benevolent people sitting at the table, their portion that was shared to them, they could hand it back to these people that were sitting and standing around the wall behind them. And coming into this scene is a woman named Mary. And Mary she stands behind Jesus, but not looking for a handout, but looking for an opportunity to bless him. And she begins to lean forward, and she begins to weep over Jesus. And she lets her tears run down her face and drip onto Jesus' feet. And then she takes her long hair down, and she begins to wipe his feet off with her hair. She washes his feet with her hair. And after she does that, she takes a bottle of perfume that is described here in the Gospels as being worth a year's wages. Now think about that. I don't know how much you earn in a year, but let's just say that it's more on the lower side. Let's just say it's $20,000 for a year's salary. A bottle of perfume worth $20,000. And she didn't open it up and just dab it a little bit on Jesus. She spent it all. She dumped it all onto Jesus' feet. And the Gospels tell us the aroma filled the house. Now, Simon and the other religious leaders that are looking, they're indignant about this. And you know what? So were the disciples. It says that the disciples sat there and went, this is a waste. That bottle of perfume could have been sold, and that $20,000, that money from that could have given to the poor. It could have helped further other ministry. This seems like just a waste for this. So I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago that some people are so focused on what they don't have, and they're grumbling about that they forget about what they do have. Well, let's look at these people in this story. What did Mary not have? What did Mary not have? Well, the first thing that she didn't have is she didn't have a seat at the table. Now, this is, I think we add to the pain of this a little bit, given this fact. It tells us that this meal is taking place in Bethany. That's her hometown. It also tells us that her brother Lazarus received an invitation to this dinner, and it also tells us that her sister Martha was one of the people serving the food. So Mary just sort of got left out. Even though her brother and her sister got invited to the dinner to either eat it or to help serve it, she was completely overlooked, and that's why she was standing next to the wall. The other thing that Mary doesn't have is a good reputation. Simon and the other religious leaders watching Jesus. What's going on here? How can we trip him up? Simon calls her twice a wicked woman, a sinner. This is what he says. Twice he says this. Does he even know what kind of woman she is? That's what he's calling her out on. Does she know what kind of woman she is? And then he even goes a little bit farther and says, if he knew that she is a sinner, does he even really aware? So she didn't have a very good reputation, especially among those religious elite. And then the other thing is she doesn't have any acceptance or approval of other people. Like I said, when she opened up that perfume and poured that out, people went, that's a waste. Maybe she was expecting people to go, hey, Mary, that was really cool. Man, that was so beautiful what you did. She didn't have that. She didn't have any of that acceptance or approval of other people. So what about these people that were complaining? I'd like to look at what they did have that they weren't focused on, that they totally missed the things that they did have. What about Simon? Well, he is a Pharisee, so he's a religious leader. And as I already mentioned, the fact that he could open up his home, that he had servants, that he had food to share, that he would open up his home not only to the invited guests, but also to the townsfolk that were kind of a little less fortunate, that could stand around the edge. That tells us that he not only had a religious position, but he also had wealth as well. And what else did he have? Well, one of the accounts tells us, it calls him Simon the leper. Now, he doesn't currently have leprosy, because if he did, he wouldn't be able to invite anybody into his home, or he could certainly extend the invitation. Nobody's going to come into his house because you stayed away from somebody with leprosy. This means Simon used to have leprosy. Simon was healed of his leprosy, he's not a leper anymore. He had experienced that healing, and yet he wasn't grateful for that. Instead, he was saying, oh, look at that woman. She is a sinner. What about the disciples? What did they have? Well, they obviously had a pretty good position. They were the disciples of Jesus. They were the inner crew, the inner circle of Jesus. Very few people could get any closer to Jesus or spend any more time or have access to him the way that the disciples did. What else did they have? Well, they also had a dinner invitation. Mary didn't even get that, but the disciples were invited along with Jesus. Jesus, you can come and please bring your disciples with you as well. They're invited to the dinner as well. They also had, remember I told you that they were grumbling about, oh, that's a waste of money. Well, that tells us that they had access to other funds that would come into their ministry that they were able to distribute and able to use to provide for their needs while they were traveling around with Jesus. So they had access to some funds. But I think more than anything else, I mean, let's not lose sight of the fact, what did they have? They had Jesus right there. They could touch him. They could talk to him. They could ask questions. They had an intimate relationship with him. They had all of these things. And what did Mary had? The only thing Mary had was forgiveness. See, because this is what Luke writes here. A woman who had lived a sinful life. That's really different from what Simon said, right? Simon said, if he knew what kind of woman she is, that she is a sinner, he wouldn't let her live down her past. But Luke said, this is a woman who had lived a sinful life. Totally different perspective, isn't it? That's all that she had was forgiveness from Jesus. And then she poured out her perfume, her praise, her gratitude, her thankfulness. She didn't hold any of that back. Now, she could have grumbled about all the stuff that she didn't have. Don't have an invitation, don't have a good reputation, I don't have approval from anybody else. I've got not. She didn't focus on that. She focused on what she did have. She had forgiveness from Jesus. And that's why we've called this series The Great Attitude of Gratitude, because there is a greatness when people focus on what they do have. Despite the fact that you could say, okay, well, here's my list of all the things that I don't have, but I'm not going to grumble. I'm not going to complain about these. I'm going to focus on what I do have, and I'm going to be grateful for that. It makes that person stand out. It is very distinguishing. It is a great attitude of gratitude. George Washington called our country to have that kind of attitude. Right at the founding of the United States, he recognized as he looked around, he says, boy, we've been awfully blessed. God has showered his favor on us in order for us to have this country that we've now established. And so this is what he pointed out for people. The hand of providence has been so conspicuous in all this that he must be worse than an infidel that lacks faith, and more than wicked that has not gratitude enough to acknowledge his obligations. His obligation to give thanks to God for all that we had received. Those are tough words. You're worse than an infidel if you're not going to give God thanks for what he's done for you. But look at this. Simon had all of these things that he didn't give thanks for. The disciples had all of these things that they didn't give thanks for. Instead, they focused on, hey, look at what she's doing. Look at this waste. Look at her past reputation. And they grumbled about that. So what did they receive for that? Well, Simon was reprimanded. Jesus said, hey, Simon, I want to ask you a question. I want you to gauge this for me. This person that was forgiven a lot of money, and this person was forgiven just a few cents, which one do you think is going to be the most grateful for the forgiveness of the debt? And he says, well, of course, the one with that was forgiven more. And he says, yeah, that's why Mary is so grateful, because so much has been forgiven of her. And then he goes on to say, you know what? You neglected all of your host duties, and she took them up for you. You didn't hug me. She's kissing my feet. You didn't wash my feet. She washed them with her tears and dried them with her hair. You didn't anoint me. You didn't even put a little dab on me. She poured out everything that she had. He was really reprimanded for that. And what about the disciples? What did they get? Well, they also got reprimanded from Jesus. He said, leave her alone. You don't realize how beautiful this thing is. What did Mary receive for this? Well, I think there's three things that Mary received. The first thing that you can't, why wouldn't you want this? The kind words from Jesus. Look at what it says in Luke's gospel. Therefore I tell you, her many sins have been forgiven, as her great love has shown. He said, he turned and looked at her and he said, let me tell you how amazing this love, this gratitude. It is a distinguishing mark. This great attitude of gratitude has distinguished you and has made you stand out. The second thing that Mary had, and I'd love to have this as well, is Jesus standing up for her. I mean, at this point, who cares whether other people go, hey, good job? Or if other people say, wow, you used to live that way and you've been forgiven and now you're not that sinful person anymore. Even if you don't have that, wouldn't you love to have the defense of Jesus? Look what it says in John's gospel. Leave her alone, Jesus replied. It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial. That perfume was going to anoint his body for burial before he was even crucified. Jesus stood up as her defender. But I think that the third thing that is absolutely amazing to me as well is that the fact that this thing that she did, this gratitude that she showed, that Jesus noted that it was going to be a testimony and it was going to be a memory of her that would outlive her life, and it would be shared as long as the gospel was shared. Look what it says in Matthew's gospel. Truly I tell you, wherever this gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. Wow. So you can say, I got all these things, but I'm not going to focus on that. Be grateful for that. I'm going to grumble about the one thing that I don't have, the one thing that she's doing, the one thing that is falling short here. You can do that. And you know what? You certainly can do that. And that grumbling is going to earn the reprimand of Jesus. Or you can focus on what you do have, even if it's only one thing. All Mary had was one thing, forgiveness from Jesus. And she was grateful for that. And as a result, Jesus turned and spoke kind words to her. He stood up to defend her. And he said, what you've done is going to be a testimony. It's going to be a memory. It's going to be an honor to you because it's going to keep pointing people to me long after you live. So friends, I think that we really can say this, that the great attitude of gratitude comes down to this. Don't grumble about what you don't have, but do be grateful for what you do have. And as we said last week, if you find grumbling words coming out of your mouth, if your ears hear those words coming out, stop yourself short and say, hey, why am I grumbling about something I don't have? Is there some other things that I do have that I could look at those. I could be grateful for those. I could give thanks for those. You see, friends, everything that we have, just like Mary, the forgiveness that she had been given to her by Jesus. Everything that we have, that we do have, not the things we don't have, but the things that we do have also been lavished on us by God. Look what Peter wrote for us. By his divine power, God has given us everything we need for living a godly life and for being grateful people. We have received all of this by coming to know him, the one who called us to himself by means of his marvelous glory and excellence. So friends, this week as you celebrate Thanksgiving Day, don't let it just be a day for giving thanks, but let it begin a pattern that you're not sitting around saying, let's see, what don't I have that I can grumble about? But that you're looking around saying, what do I have that I can be grateful for? That I can give thanks, that I can focus here. And remember, as Ian Bound said to us, Murmuring, complaining, and gratitude can't be in the same heart at the same time. Can't be in the same mouth at the same time. So the more that you are grateful, the harder it'll be for grumbling to come into your mouth and into your heart. Get the right perspective. Yes, maybe there's some things that you don't have. But if you have nothing else, you have Jesus. And for that, you can be eternally grateful. God bless you, friends. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. As always, if you have questions or comments, leave them below or reach out to me in other ways. I'd love to be able to dialogue with you. I love you.